On June 1, 1921, residents of Greenwood called the police for protection. The chief in charge did not deploy decisive force. In less than 24 hours, their homes and businesses were destroyed, while authority remained in place, and no immediate protest altered the outcome. Greenwood burned while he watched. Chief Gustafson's silence centers on what happened in Tulsa, Oklahoma, in the early hours of June 1, 1921. The victim was not a single building, nor a single storefront. It was the Greenwood District, known nationally at the time as Black Wall Street. The act of injustice was direct and measurable. As violence escalated and fires spread, law enforcement under the authority of Police Chief John A. Gustafson failed to stop the destruction of a defined community within city limits. Control did not pass to a rival militia or a distant federal body. It remained within Tulsa's municipal structure. Contemporary records and later state findings, including the 2001 Oklahoma Commission to study the Tulsa Race Riot, documented institutional failures in protection and response. This episode will examine how that failure occurred without immediate removal from office, without prosecution, and without national intervention in 1921. By May 31, 1921, Tulsa was not an obscure frontier settlement. It was a growing oil city with a reputation for economic expansion and civic ambition. Greenwood District stood as a concentrated center of black entrepreneurship. Hotels, medical offices, theaters, and retail corridors along Greenwood Avenue. The 1920 U.S. Census reflected a stable and expanding black population in the area. Its prosperity was not theoretical. It was documented in property deeds, business licenses, and tax rolls. That visibility carried status. It also carried exposure. The immediate catalyst was the arrest of Dick Rowland on May 30, 1921, following an allegation involving an elevator operator in the Drexel building. The Tulsa Tribune published a report that, afternoon, by the evening of May 31st, a crowd had gathered at the Tulsa County Courthouse. The city's law enforcement hierarchy was intact. Chief Gustafson held formal command over police operations. Officers were present. Authority was not absent. It was positioned. When confrontation began, the first shots were reported outside the courthouse. Within hours, violence moved across the Frisco Railroad tracks into Greenwood. Witness testimony collected decades later described systematic fires. By sunrise on June 1st, entire blocks were burning. The Oklahoma National Guard would declare martial law later that morning. In the interval between escalation and containment, hundreds of structures were destroyed. Contemporary estimates indicated more than 1,000 homes and businesses were reduced to debris within a single day. Publicly, the language of order and restoration followed. Privately, decisions about deployment, restraint, and prioritization had already been made. The record does not show a total absence of police presence. It shows an absence of effective protection for Greenwood residents. Arrests were made, but primarily of black residents. Detention centers were organized. Control was reasserted, but after the district had been devastated. Tulsa's reputation survived. Its oil economy continued. Chief Gustafson was not removed in immediate disgrace. No sweeping federal investigation unfolded in 1921. For decades, the event received limited national attention. Newspaper coverage, at the time, framed the violence within the conventions of the era. The gap between image and outcome widened quietly. A city could rebuild its commercial districts. It could not restore the accumulated capital, records, and security erased overnight in Greenwood. This investigation does not rely on rumor. It relies on documented sequence. May 30th, arrest. May 31st, courthouse confrontation. June 1st, destruction. later findings by the Oklahoma Commission and modern review by the U.S. Department of Justice acknowledging institutional failure while noting legal barriers to prosecution. The central question is narrower than outrage and broader than blame. Authority existed. A defined district requested protection. Protection was not delivered in time to prevent large-scale destruction. If you are drawn to examining what archived reports and municipal records reveal behind closed doors, Beyond the Golden Halls follows these cases through primary documents and are measured like signals. Engagement with the evidence itself. The official language described order restored. The photographs show blocks leveled. Between those two realities sits a command structure that did not collapse. It remained. The silence preceded the smoke. A ledger entry, a deployment log, a courthouse corridor. On paper, Greenwood's prosperity was not rumor or resentment. It was recorded. The 1920 United States Census listed more than 10,000 black residents within Tulsa, many concentrated in the Greenwood District. Enumerators documented occupations, property status, family structures, literacy, and employment stability. Those forms were not advocacy. They were federal instruments of measurement. In 1920, measurement confirmed that Greenwood was not an improvised settlement, but a structured urban economy operating inside a segregated city. That fact alone altered how it was perceived by those who controlled municipal levers of power. The Greenwood District did not grow in defiance of law. It grew. Within it, segregation ordinances and housing restrictions confined black residents to specific areas of Tulsa. Within those confines, enterprise consolidated. By early 1921, Greenwood Avenue hosted physicians' offices, insurance agents, restaurants, a newspaper, and the Stratford Hotel, one of the largest black-owned hotels in the United States. Property deeds filed with the Tulsa County Clerk's Office reflected ownership patterns that translated into capital accumulation. The existence of this concentration was not accidental. It was a consequence of policy and exclusion. Yet by 1920, it had matured into a visible economic engine. That visibility carried administrative implications. When a district concentrates taxable property, insured structures, and independent financial institutions, it becomes legible to power. City authorities, including the Tulsa Police Department and Municipal Council, were not ignorant of Greenwood's scale. They assessed it, they regulated it, they patrolled its perimeters. Its prosperity was catalogued through taxation and licensing. The very systems that constrained its geographic boundaries also registered its growth. Hostility did not emerge in a vacuum. Newspapers in the early 20th century shaped civic perception. The Tulsa Tribune, circulating widely in 1921, operated within a competitive media environment that amplified incidents tied to race and order. Reputation mattered. Greenwood's success challenged inherited narratives about hierarchy in a city fueled by oil wealth and rapid expansion. Its banks extended credit, its businesses employed workers, its property owners accumulated equity within a segregated structure that was never designed to produce parity. The contradiction was not theoretical, it was spatial and financial. On May 30th, 1921, when Dick Rowland was arrested following an allegation involving Sarah Page in the Drexel building, the tension that followed did not arise in a city unaware of Greenwood's prominence. It arose in a city where that prominence was already documented and resented in private conversations and public rumor. The courthouse gathering on May 31st did not occur in a landscape of invisibility. It occurred in a city where a defined district had demonstrated economic autonomy under constraint. The risk embedded in that autonomy was not only symbolic. It intersected with property values, insurance liability, and political optics. When a concentrated black business district thrives inside a segregated municipality, it exposes structural limits placed on white-owned expansion in adjacent zones. It creates competitive friction. It complicates narratives of dependency. For some, it destabilizes the presumed order. The census figures of 1920 became more than demographic entries. They confirmed density. Density implies collective capacity. Collective capacity can be perceived as leverage. In an era when racial violence had erupted in other American cities, Chicago in 1919, for example, municipal leaders understood that concentrated black populations could become flashpoints under provocation. That understanding shaped how police calculated deployment and restraint. Greenwood's residents invested in permanence. Mortgages were signed, insurance policies were purchased, commercial inventories were stocked. The Stratford Hotel stood not as a gesture but as infrastructure. Each act of ownership created documentation. Each document created traceable value. And value, when held by those excluded from broader political power, becomes politically charged. On the evening of May 31, 1921, as crowds gathered at the Tulsa County Courthouse, the district they would later cross into was not abstract. It was surveyed, mapped, and assessed. Police Chief John A. Gustafson operated within a city whose power structure was aware of Greenwood's economic profile. The existence of that profile framed every subsequent choice. The question was never whether Greenwood mattered. The question was how its mattering would be treated under stress. When violence moved toward Greenwood in the early hours of June 1st, the consequences extended beyond physical structures. The destruction of more than 1,000 homes and businesses erased accumulated equity recorded over years. Insurance claims were widely denied on the grounds of riot clauses. The financial consequence was not temporary displacement. It was the forced liquidation of capital without compensation. That result did not occur in a vacuum. It occurred in a district whose prosperity had already been registered by the same civic systems that failed to shield it. Greenwood's success, documented in 1920, became a vulnerability by 1921. The more consolidated the economy, the more efficient its eradication under coordinated attack. A scattered settlement would have dispersed impact. A concentrated district allowed it to be engulfed block by block. The transformation from asset to target was not announced. Publicly, it unfolded through perception, rumor, and calculation inside existing power networks. This was the context into which authorities stepped, or failed to step, on May 31st and June 1st. Greenwood was not merely a neighborhood experiencing unrest. It was a ledger of ownership, a cluster of institutions, a visible counterexample to imposed limitation. That visibility made it legible. That legibility made it vulnerable. The records that survive, census sheets, property filings, insurance forms, do not dramatize, they quantify. They reveal that the district's prosperity was neither myth nor exaggeration. It was measurable. And what is measurable can be weighed in decisions of deployment, restraint, and risk. In the days before the fires, Greenwood stood intact, enumerated, insured, and mapped. Within hours, its material proof of stability would be reduced to ash. The context does not accuse, it clarifies the stakes. A thriving district inside a segregated city was a point of tension long before a single shot was fired. By midnight on May 31st, that tension converged with rumor and armed presence. The district that federal census takers had counted just months earlier would become the site of concentrated destruction. Prosperity had not protected it. Visibility had not shielded it. Instead, those qualities intensified the consequence of what followed. And when the first embers reached Greenwood Avenue, they did not encounter an informal camp or marginal outpost. they met brick. Facades, hotel rooms, insurance ledgers, and deed books, assets that had been formally recognized by the very institutions that now hesitated to defend them. The paper trail remains. The district does not. The decision did not require a speech. It required restraint, or its opposite. On May 31st, 1921, as crowds gathered outside the Tulsa County Courthouse following the arrest of Dick Rowland, Police Chief John A. Gustafson held formal authority over deployment, arrest procedure, and crowd control within the city limits of Tulsa. That authority was not symbolic. It carried operational discretion. By late afternoon, tension was visible. Armed white residents assembled in increasing numbers. Black veterans from Greenwood arrived later, offering to assist in protecting Rowland from lynching. The balance was fragile, but not yet irreversible. At that stage, command options existed. The Tulsa Police Department could have dispersed the crowd with coordinated force. Additional officers could have been reassigned from patrol districts. The courthouse perimeter could have been restricted. Known agitators could have been removed under disorderly conduct statutes. Instead, what the record reflects is hesitation. The Oklahoma Commission to Study the Tulsa Race Riot, in its 2001 report, later described the response as insufficient and poorly controlled. The absence of decisive containment allowed the confrontation to escalate from threat to gunfire. The choice not to isolate the courthouse was not passive drift. It was an exercise of discretion. Chief Gustafson did not declare a preemptive restriction of assembly. He did not order the immediate sealing of adjacent streets before the crowd swelled. He did not request early National Guard mobilization while the confrontation remained localized. Those were available mechanisms within municipal power. Their non-use altered the sequence of events. When the first shot was fired outside the courthouse late on May 31st, authority did not disappear. It remained in the hands of the Tulsa Police Department, yet officers did not execute a coordinated push to prevent armed individuals from crossing the Frisco Railroad tracks into Greenwood. Patrol patterns were not reorganized to form a defensive perimeter. No emergency curfew was immediately enforced within the most vulnerable district. These omissions were not chaotic gaps. They were administrative decisions made under pressure. The consequence of that decision emerged within hours. Violence migrated geographically. What had been concentrated at the courthouse began spreading toward Greenwood. By midnight, scattered fires were reported. By the early hours of June 1st, 1921, the district was under sustained assault. Once violence crossed into residential and commercial blocks, containment required a different scale of force. That scale was not present when it might have prevented escalation. The record shows that martial law was declared by the Oklahoma National Guard on the morning of June 1st, but that declaration followed the expansion, not its prevention. The timing matters. Early intervention could have isolated the courthouse disturbance. Delayed mobilization required reaction to widespread destruction. Authority acted after damage, not before it. Chief Gustafson's position was not ceremonial. As head of the Tulsa Police Department, he controlled operational priorities. On May 31st, the choice to allow the armed crowd to remain assembled without dispersal transformed a volatile gathering into a sustained conflict. The decision did not ignite the fire. It permitted the fire to find oxygen. This was not the absence of law. It was selective application. Black residents who arrived at the courthouse were disarmed by police. White residents who had gathered earlier were not immediately dispersed with comparable urgency. That distinction was noted in survivor testimony and later historical review. Power was exercised asymmetrically. The immediate consequence was loss of equilibrium at the site of initial tension. The legal consequence was indirect, but enduring. When insurance claims were later filed by Greenwood property owners, many were denied under riot exclusion clauses. Insurers categorized the destruction as civil disorder rather than isolated arson. The municipal failure to contain the initial confrontation contributed to that classification. What began as a courthouse gathering became a citywide event. That transformation affected financial liability across hundreds of families. On May 31, 1921, the chain of command ran from Chief Gustafson to officers on the ground. Decisions flowed downward. Containment required coordination. Coordination required instruction. The absence of a clear, restrictive directive allowed events to accelerate beyond localized conflict. The escalation was not inevitable. It followed a failure to impose limits when limits were still enforceable. Authority is often measured by action. It can also be measured by restraint from action. In this instance, restraint operated not as de-escalation, but as tolerance of growing disorder. When armed men began moving toward Greenwood, the decision not to intercept them before they crossed district boundaries carried measurable impact. Once inside Greenwood, they encountered homes, businesses, and residents with limited protection. The Tulsa Tribune's earlier coverage had already inflamed public sentiment. Law enforcement's responsibility at that moment was not editorial correction, but physical control. That control was incomplete. The consequence was spatial expansion of violence from a single courthouse location into a defined economic district. In administrative language, this was a failure of containment. In lived terms, it was the difference between tension outside a courthouse and destruction across 35 square blocks. The decision on May 31st to refrain from aggressive dispersal did not conclude the bad event. It determined its scale. The aftermath did not produce immediate dismissal or prosecution of Chief Gustafson. He remained within the institutional structure. The absence of immediate accountability signaled that the decision would not be formally contested within city leadership at the time. That institutional continuity matters. It demonstrates that the choice made under pressure did not violate prevailing political alignment. The escalation from courthouse confrontation to district-wide destruction was not instantaneous. It unfolded over hours in which intervention was possible. The decision not to mobilize full containment resources before midnight on May 31st stands as a hinge. From that hinge, events widened. By the time smoke rose over Greenwood Avenue on June 1st, the opportunity for simple containment had passed. What remained was reaction to catastrophe rather than prevention of it. The decision had already been made. In the surviving accounts, there is no dramatic proclamation attached to that moment. There is only sequence: arrest on May 30th, crowd on May 31st, insufficient dispersal, first shot, spread of violence, delayed martial law. Between those entries lies discretion exercised and not exercised. The courthouse steps still stand in Tulsa. The decision taken there in 1921 does not. What remains is a record of authority present and a district left exposed. On May 30th, 1921, a brief encounter inside the Drexel building in downtown Tulsa was converted into a public accusation before any formal charge had been tested in court. Dick Rowland, a 19-year-old black shoe shiner, was arrested after an allegation involving Sarah Page, a white elevator operator. The arrest itself followed established procedure. What followed did not. By the afternoon of May 30th, the Tulsa Tribune had published a report describing the alleged incident in language that implied assault. Contemporary accounts and later historical review indicate that an editorial or additional inflammatory text may have accompanied the news item, though surviving copies are incomplete. What remains documented is that the article framed the event as a threat requiring vigilance. The newspaper did not wait for indictment. It did not clarify uncertainty. It printed urgency. This was not a private accusation. It was a mass communication event. The Tulsa Tribune operated within a competitive press environment where headlines shaped public reaction within hours. On May 31, 1921, copies circulated across a city already structured by segregation and economic tension. A single allegation moved from an elevator car to public consciousness without filtration. The legal status of Dick Rowland at that moment was that of a detainee, not a convicted offender. Yet by the evening of May 31st, white residents had gathered outside the Tulsa County Courthouse demanding access to him. The language of lynching entered public rumor. The sequence between arrest and assembly was short. The speed matters. Here the record reveals something more precise than atmosphere. Police authorities, including Chief John A. Gustafson, controlled custody of Rowland. They could have restricted public access to courthouse grounds earlier in the day. They could have declared a perimeter before crowds formed. Instead, what is documented is that the courthouse steps became a staging ground for a growing armed presence. The injustice embedded in this moment lies not in speculation about motive, but in the transformation of an allegation into civic mobilization without evidentiary scrutiny. A black teenager accused in a segregated city was exposed to public retaliation before due process began. That exposure was facilitated by print amplification and insufficient narrative correction. No official statement was issued on May 30th to calm the city. No public declaration clarified the absence of confirmed assault. The Tulsa Police Department did not immediately release language designed to reduce escalation. Silence in official channels permitted rumor to operate as fact. By the evening of May 31st, multiple witnesses described armed white men gathering near the courthouse. Black residents from Greenwood, aware of the history of lynchings in the region, traveled downtown to ensure Rowland would not be forcibly removed. Their presence was defensive, but it was perceived as provocation. The discovery here is not hidden in archives. It is visible in sequence. An arrest on May 30th. A newspaper. Headline: A crowd by May 31st. No corrective intervention strong enough to prevent mass assembly. The chain is direct. The Tulsa Tribune's decision to publish without moderating language constituted an action of influence. Chief Gustafson's department retained authority over crowd management, but did not seal the courthouse square before escalation. The power to prevent assembly existed. It was not exercised in time. The consequence was measurable. When the first confrontation occurred outside the courthouse on the night of May 31st, it was not spontaneous combustion. It was the culmination of 2 days in which information moved faster than containment. This discovery does not rely on interpretation of private correspondence. It relies on dated publication and documented arrest logs. Dick Rowland's detention was recorded. The Tribune's article was circulated. Crowds gathered in response. Those facts form a pattern. The injury began before the first building burned. It began when a single accusation was broadcast into a city primed by racial hierarchy and economic tension. Rowland's legal vulnerability became Greenwood's structural vulnerability. The Drexel building still exists. Its elevator shaft no longer carries the same names, but the event of May 30th, 1921, remains tied to that space. A confined interaction was expanded into civic emergency. The expansion was not inevitable, it was accelerated. In the hours between publication and assembly, institutional power could have intervened through public clarification. It did not. The absence of a restraining statement functioned as permission for rumor to solidify. The people most directly harmed at this stage were those whose lives were tethered to Greenwood. The allegation against Rowland became justification for collective suspicion toward a district already viewed with economic hostility. The courthouse gathering did not distinguish between an individual and a community. By the time confrontation erupted on May 31st, the narrative had already been set in motion. A young man accused, a headline published, a city mobilized. Due process had not begun. Public judgment had. The discovery is stark in its simplicity. The ignition point was not gunfire, it was publication. The courthouse lights remained on as the crowd thickened. The presses had already cooled. The words remained. The first shot did not erase the structure of authority. It exposed it. On the night of May 31st, 1921, outside the Tulsa County courthouse, the crowd that had gathered through rumor and publication hardened into formation. White men stood armed in visible numbers, many carrying rifles openly. Black veterans from Greenwood, some recently returned from World War I, arrived in smaller groups with the stated purpose of preventing the lynching of Dick Rowland. The courthouse steps became a line. The confrontation has often been described as spontaneous. The surviving records complicate that description. By 9 p.m., the crowd had grown significantly. Tulsa police officers were present. Sheriff Willard McCullough controlled the jail interior. Chief John A. Gustafson retained authority over city police outside. No comprehensive dispersal order was executed before midnight. No full perimeter was sealed in advance of armed escalation. The space remained porous. What followed has been reconstructed through testimony, later investigation, and fragmentary press coverage. A black veteran was reportedly approached and told to surrender his weapon. He refused. A struggle ensued. A shot was fired. In that instant, confrontation became exchange. The initial discharge did not end in isolation. It multiplied. Gunfire spread across the courthouse lawn and into adjacent streets. Here the discovery lies not in who fired first, but in what happened next. Armed white men were not immediately disarmed en masse. They were not removed from the area under riot control authority. Instead, as shots echoed, many were deputized. Historical accounts indicate that some white civilians were temporarily commissioned by local authorities to assist in restoring order. That act, effectively legitimizing armed participation, altered the character of the confrontation. Deputization was not neutral. It was a formal extension of power. When armed civilians are granted temporary authority by a law enforcement structure, the line between restraint and endorsement shifts. On May 31, 1921, that line blurred. The consequence was immediate. Escalation gained institutional cover. The police did not declare an immediate curfew when the first exchange occurred. They did not clear the courthouse square with overwhelming force. Instead, gunfire expanded outward. The confrontation ceased to be localized and became directional. Shots moved north toward the Frisco Railroad tracks, which marked the boundary between downtown Tulsa and Greenwood. The collapse of order was not abstract. It was geographic. Within hours, armed groups crossed into Greenwood. The Tulsa Police Department did not establish a defensive barricade at the boundary before that movement. Whether through incapacity or omission, the district was left exposed. The legal consequence of that shift was profound. Once violence entered Greenwood, the classification of events expanded from attempted lynching prevention to riot. Under Oklahoma law at the time, riot designation carried implications for insurance coverage. Many property policies contained riot exclusion clauses. The reclassification of violence as riot rather than isolated criminal acts would later enable insurers to deny claims. The failure to contain the courthouse confrontation altered financial outcomes for hundreds of property owners. By midnight, multiple reports indicate that fires had begun. Officers were still present in parts of the city, but coordination fractured. The chain of command did not dissolve, it fragmented. In that fragmentation, armed civilians gained operational latitude. The injustice at this stage is measurable in differential treatment. Black men arriving at the courthouse were quickly disarmed. White men arriving earlier remained armed for extended periods. When shots were fired, enforcement did not fall evenly. Detentions disproportionately affected black residents as the night progressed. The courthouse, a symbol of law, became the pivot point from which law receded. Authority did not declare its withdrawal. It manifested through selective engagement, the decision not to disperse before escalation, followed by the effective authorization of armed white civilians, created momentum that could not be easily reversed. On June 1st, 1921, as daylight approached, violence inside Greenwood intensified. Homes were entered, businesses were looted, structures were set ablaze. The escalation from courthouse confrontation to district assault was not accidental drift. It followed a night in which armed mobilization had been permitted to grow under incomplete restraint. The Oklahoma National Guard would eventually declare martial law, but that declaration came after the spread. The first hours, those between confrontation and containment, defined the scale of destruction. The courthouse steps remained physically intact after the smoke cleared. The chain of decisions that unfolded there left no permanent plaque. Yet the pattern remains visible in sequence: assembly, hesitation, shot, deputization, migration, fire. The armed crowd did not materialize without notice. It gathered in view of authority. The confrontation did not erupt without warning. It expanded in the absence of decisive interruption. By the time the Frisco tracks were crossed, Greenwood was no longer insulated by geography. It was within range. The courthouse clock tower marked the hour. The gunfire had already moved beyond it. At first light on June 1st, 1921, the character of violence in Tulsa shifted from confrontation to systematic destruction. Greenwood Avenue, which the 1920 U.S. Census had documented as the spine of a concentrated black business district, was no longer a corridor of commerce. It became a corridor of fire. The transformation was not random. It followed direction. Witness statements later collected by the Oklahoma Commission to study the Tulsa Race Riot in 2001 describe coordinated movement across blocks. Structures were entered, looted, and ignited. Fires did not erupt in isolation, they advanced in patterns. Multiple accounts referenced aircraft circling overhead that morning. Some survivors testified that objects were dropped from those planes, though the precise nature of those objects remains historically debated. What is not debated is that flames spread in a sequence consistent with deliberate targeting of commercial property. The Stratford Hotel, once one of the largest black-owned hotels in the United States, was reduced to ruins. Doctors' offices, pharmacies, and newspaper presses were destroyed. By midday on June 1st, more than 1,200 homes had been burned. The economic district that had been catalogued in deeds and insurance policies was erased in hours. The discovery within this devastation is not the existence of fire. It is the simultaneous exercise of state authority in a direction that deepened injury. As destruction intensified, Tulsa police officers and members of the Oklahoma National Guard began detaining black residents en masse. Rather than forming a protective barrier between armed white civilians and Greenwood property, law enforcement units redirected manpower toward rounding up those fleeing the flames. Detentions were not incidental. Black men and women were escorted at gunpoint to temporary holding sites, including the convention hall and the fairgrounds. They were required to carry identification cards to prove employment or sponsorship before release. This was not a spontaneous protective measure, it was a structured restriction. On June 1st, 1921, martial law was declared by the Oklahoma National Guard, but its implementation disproportionately confined victims rather than aggressors. That alteration in enforcement priority had measurable consequence. Residents attempting to defend homes or extinguish fires were removed from the district. Families were separated. Property was left unguarded. The forced displacement of thousands of Greenwood residents created an emptying effect that accelerated the physical collapse of the neighborhood. Without occupants, structures burned unchecked. Insurance implications compounded the loss. Because the event was categorized as a riot, many claims were denied under riot exclusion clauses. The coordinated nature of the fires did not convert them into compensable arson in the eyes of insurers. The financial consequence was catastrophic. Generational wealth documented only months earlier was nullified without restitution. The morning's destruction was not merely physical but administrative. When black residents were detained and restricted to holding centers, their access to legal recourse, documentation, and property records was effectively suspended. Deeds, contracts, and inventories stored within homes and businesses were incinerated. The legal proof of ownership that underpinned Greenwood's economic stability vanished with the structures themselves. Reports indicate that some fires were set after properties had already been vacated. Looting preceded ignition in numerous cases. The progression suggests sequence, not chaos. Greenwood Avenue did not collapse through random skirmish. It was dismantled block by block. Authority remained visible throughout. Uniformed officers were present. Armed National Guardsmen were stationed in key areas. The difference lay in directional application. Instead of sealing Greenwood's perimeter against incoming armed civilians, enforcement concentrated on containing the displaced. The imbalance carried immediate social consequence. Thousands were rendered refugees within their own city. By late afternoon on June 1st, smoke obscured much of the district. Photographs taken that day show skeletal brick walls and open sky where rooftops had stood. The census counts of 1920 were rendered abstract in ash. The district's physical footprint was altered beyond recognition. The decision to detain victims rather than prioritize defense did more than fail protection. It institutionalized vulnerability. When residents were required to register for release under martial law, the power dynamic shifted permanently. Freedom of movement became conditional. Ownership became theoretical. No comprehensive arrest sweep targeted those who had set fires in comparable scale. This asymmetry in enforcement would later complicate legal accountability. The morning of June 1st created a record of who was confined and who moved freely. The destruction of Greenwood Avenue did not conclude at sunset. Fires smoldered into the evening. By the time containment stabilized the area, an estimated 35 square blocks had been devastated. More than 10,000 people were displaced. The concentration of black economic life that had been visible in tax rolls and census sheets ceased to exist in functional form. The injustice that began with rumor and hesitation matured into systematic erasure. The removal of residents under armed supervision, the coordinated spread of flames, and the absence of equivalent restraint on those advancing through the district formed a pattern that cannot be reduced to spontaneous riot. On June 1st, 1921, the geography of Tulsa changed. The boundary at the Frisco tracks no longer marked separation between downtown and prosperity. It marked the edge of ruin. When the smoke thinned, Greenwood Avenue was not recognizable as a commercial corridor. It was a field of foundations and chimneys. Detention lines extended outside Convention Hall. Names were recorded. Properties were not. A ledger of Arrests existed, a ledger of loss did not. On the morning of June 1, 1921, the language of restoration replaced the language of confrontation. The Oklahoma National Guard formally declared martial law in Tulsa. The declaration was recorded as a stabilizing measure. It signaled that civilian authority would yield temporarily to military oversight. In theory, such a declaration is intended to suppress violence, restore order, and protect life and property. In practice, the implementation altered the direction of force. By the time martial law was imposed, Greenwood Avenue was already burning. The Guard's arrival did not precede destruction, it followed it. Units were deployed into the city with authority to detain, restrict movement, and secure designated areas. Yet the enforcement pattern that emerged did not focus on arresting armed white civilians who had advanced into Greenwood. Instead, black residents were systematically rounded up. Surviving accounts and official summaries indicate that thousands of black men, women, and children were detained under armed supervision. They were escorted to centralized holding locations, including the Convention Hall and the Tulsa Fairgrounds. Entry and exit were controlled. Identification badges were required for release. Freedom of movement became conditional. This was not incidental crowd management. It was structured confinement. Individuals who had lost homes hours earlier were required to register with authorities in order to leave detention. Release was often conditioned upon verification by a white employer or sponsor who could vouch for them. In effect, liberty was temporarily reassigned to private white citizens through endorsement. The Guard did not invent this hierarchy. It formalized it. Martial law codified a reality in which the victims of destruction were treated as potential threats, requiring containment. Those who had moved into Greenwood with weapons were not confined at comparable scale. The inversion was administrative, not rhetorical. The decision to detain black residents en masse carried immediate social consequence. Families were separated, business owners were prevented from returning to their properties to salvage records or extinguish embers. Homes that might have been partially saved were left unprotected. The forced absence of residents accelerated material loss. Financial consequences followed swiftly. Property owners attempting to document losses for insurance purposes faced logistical barriers. Deeds and policy papers had already been burned in many cases. Access to surviving documentation was restricted by detention. The combination of riot classification and physical displacement made claims difficult to substantiate. Insurers would later deny many of them. On June 1, 1921, the imposition of martial law was framed publicly as necessary to quell unrest. Yet the structure of enforcement redirected scrutiny away from those who had initiated violence and toward those who had suffered it. This reorientation influenced the narrative that hardened in the weeks that followed. Official statements emphasized riot and disorder. The vocabulary of organized assault faded behind the broader label of civil disturbance. Responsibility was diffused into general chaos. The concentrated role of specific actors became obscured by institutional phrasing. The Guard's authority allowed it to restrict access to Greenwood. Journalists, property owners, and observers were limited. In movement, control over physical space translated into control over visibility. The district became a managed zone. What occurred within its boundaries during the final hours of destruction was not fully documented in real time. This redirection of enforcement reshaped public perception. When victims are detained and aggressors move freely, the visual record itself alters. Photographs taken that day show long lines of black residents under guard. They do not show comparable images of white civilians being processed. The image becomes part of the narrative. Legally, martial law did not retroactively define guilt. Socially, it signaled containment of one population. The institutional message was subtle but enduring. The threat had been neutralized by detaining Greenwood. In the days after June 1st, city leaders would focus on reconstruction plans and zoning debates. Some proposals even suggested relocating Greenwood residents to a different area of Tulsa. The discussion did not center on prosecution of those who set fires. It centered on managing the aftermath, the Guards' intervention, while halting further immediate expansion of violence, also froze a version of events into official memory. The cause was framed as riot. The response was framed as order restored. The asymmetry in detention faded behind the language of stabilization. This was institutionalization of omission. Authority did not deny that violence occurred. It denied through enforcement pattern that protection had failed in a specific direction. On June 1st, the convention hall floor was crowded with detainees. Identification tags hung from clothing. Outside, smoke drifted over Greenwood Avenue. The guard maintained perimeter control. The district was silent, but not secure. In 2001, 80 years after Greenwood Avenue had been reduced to ash, the state of Oklahoma formally reopened the record. The Oklahoma Commission to Study the Tulsa Race Riot issued its final report on February 28, 2001. The act itself was administrative. The state of Oklahoma created a commission, gathered testimony, reviewed surviving documents, and published findings. For the first time in a structured, state-sanctioned document, institutional failure was acknowledged in precise language. The report did not rely on rumor. It examined archived newspapers, insurance records, death estimates, property assessments, and survivor testimony. It identified that law enforcement, including the Tulsa Police Department, had failed to protect Greenwood residents on May 31st and June 1st, 1921. It documented that black residents were detained en masse while white civilians moved with relative freedom. It confirmed that more than 1,000 homes had been destroyed and that thousands had been displaced. The discovery embedded in that report was not merely historical detail, it was structural acknowledgement. The Commission concluded that public officials had, at minimum, omitted decisive protection. It identified systemic breakdowns in authority and restraint. In effect, the state of Oklahoma recognized that Greenwood's destruction was not solely the product of mob spontaneity. Institutional omission was part of the sequence. Yet the report also contained an absence. No individual, no police chief John A. Gustafson, no specific officer, no named city official was indicted or prosecuted as a result of the Commission's findings. The statute of limitations, the deaths of primary actors, and the passage of time were cited as barriers to criminal action. Recognition did not translate into charges. The Commission recommended reparations in various forms, including direct payments to survivors and descendants, the creation of scholarship funds, and economic development initiatives for Greenwood. These recommendations were concrete. They were written into the document. They represented acknowledgement of material loss. But recommendation is not execution. While certain memorial and educational efforts followed, comprehensive financial reparations were not implemented at the scale suggested. The legal consequence was limited. No retroactive criminal accountability occurred. No court-adjudicated responsibility for the omission of protection in 1921. The 2001 report altered the official narrative. For decades, the event had often been framed as a riot initiated by mutual hostility. The Commission's language reframed it as a massacre rooted in racial animus and facilitated by institutional failure. That alteration mattered. It shifted public terminology. It influenced academic study. It entered textbooks and public discourse. However, alteration of terminology did not alter legal closure. Survivors who were still alive in 2001 had lived through 8 decades without compensation for destroyed property or detained liberty. The acknowledgement came after economic loss had calcified into generational disparity. The injustice identified in the report was precise. Authorities had failed to protect Greenwood when protection was possible. The report did not soften that conclusion. It did not obscure it in abstraction. It recorded omission. The state of Oklahoma, through the commission, exercised power by declaring an official interpretation of history. That declaration did not seal archives. It did not remove names from record. It added pages to the file. The consequence of that addition was paradoxical. The massacre became widely recognized. The failure of law enforcement entered formal acknowledgement. Yet no living institution bore criminal penalty. The record expanded. Accountability did not. For descendants of Greenwood residents, the recognition was both validation and limitation. The state had admitted structural failure. It had not restored capital, land value, or lost inheritance at equivalent scale. Insurance claims denied in 1921 were not reopened. Property titles burned in the fires were not reconstructed through state compensation. Programs. In the years following 2001, public commemorations increased, monuments were erected, educational curricula were updated. The centennial in 2021 brought national attention. The Commission's findings were cited in speeches and legal filings, yet the gap between acknowledgement and remedy remained visible. The report itself stands as a document of dual force. It exposes institutional omission while simultaneously marking the end of criminal pursuit. It is both revelation and closure. The names of those who held authority in 1921, including Police Chief John A. Gustafson, appear in historical accounts. They do not appear in indictments. Recognition without prosecution creates a specific tension. It affirms that harm occurred under authority. It concedes that protection was not delivered. It leaves intact the absence of penal consequence. The Oklahoma Commission to study the Tulsa Race Riot did not erase the injustice described in its pages. It recorded it. It preserved testimony that might otherwise have vanished with the last living witnesses. But preservation is not correction. In 2001, the state wrote into its official archive that Greenwood had not simply burned, it had been failed. The printed report sits bound, its pages numbered. The signatures at the end confirm completion. The file is closed. The question it leaves open is not what happened. It is why recognition stopped there. After the Oklahoma Commission to study the Tulsa Race Riot released its findings on February 28, 2001, the official record shifted in tone, but not in liability. The language of riot gradually yielded to massacre in state documents and public discourse. That change was not cosmetic. Terminology influences legal posture, educational framing, and public memory. Yet the revised terminology did not reopen criminal files. No grand jury was convened. No retroactive indictment was pursued against any surviving institution. In the months that followed the report's publication, the Oklahoma legislature debated aspects of the Commission's recommendations. Some initiatives moved forward in limited form, including scholarship funds and memorial projects. The Greenwood Cultural Center received increased recognition. Historical markers were installed. Public ceremonies acknowledged the scale of destruction. These were acts of symbolic correction. They did not reconstruct the lost tax base of 1921. The Commission's own language made clear that municipal authorities had failed to protect Greenwood residents. That conclusion was recorded. it entered the public archive. However, the state did not establish a judicial mechanism to test individual responsibility in civil court on behalf of survivors. The passage of time was cited as a structural barrier. Statutes of limitation had expired. Key actors were deceased. The legal system treated the delay as neutral. For survivors, the delay had been imposed by silence. The practical effect of this boundary was measurable. Insurance denials from the 1920s were not revisited. Property valuations erased by fire were not recalculated for restitution. Land that had once anchored generational wealth remained outside formal compensation frameworks. The recognition of institutional omission did not produce institutional repayment. In 2003 and 2004, civil suits were filed by survivors seeking reparations. Federal courts ultimately dismissed those claims on procedural grounds, citing statutes of limitation. The dismissal did not dispute the occurrence of destruction. It ruled on timeliness. The consequence was definitive. The judiciary would not adjudicate the substance of the harm. The case closed on technical grounds. This sequence introduced a second layer of silence. The first had followed the flames in 1921. The second followed acknowledgement in 2001. Recognition without enforceable remedy placed the injustice into the category of historical tragedy rather than actionable wrong. The archive expanded. The legal door narrowed. By the centennial in 2021, the city of Tulsa had organized commemorative events and public discussions. National attention intensified. Federal review by the U.S. Department of Justice would later acknowledge the massacre's racial nature and institutional failure, while confirming that prosecution was legally impossible due to the deaths of responsible individuals and the expiration of statutes. The pattern repeated: documentation without penalty. The legacy of the 2001 Commission is therefore dual. It preserved testimony that might otherwise have vanished. It reframed the narrative at a state level. It also delineated the boundary beyond which the state would not move. That boundary has financial and moral dimensions. Greenwood today contains memorials and cultural institutions. It does not contain the uninterrupted economic continuity it once possessed. The report's acknowledgement did not restore the compounding value of destroyed businesses. It did not repair the generational interruption caused by displacement and denied claims. The injustice remains visible in structural form. Wealth accumulation lost in 1921 was never allowed to mature. The absence is not rhetorical. It is measurable in land ownership patterns, in commercial density, in capital access across decades. The Commission's final pages carry signatures. They certify completion of investigation. They do not certify completion of accountability. In a state archive in Oklahoma City, the bound volume remains accessible. Its pages identify institutional omission. Its recommendations remain partially implemented. Its legal consequences remain limited. Recognition became part of the official record. Redress did not. And the distance between those two words continues to define the legacy of June 1st, 1921. In 2024, more than a century after June 1st, 1921, the U.S. Department of Justice completed a formal review of the Tulsa Race Massacre. The act was administrative but consequential. The federal government examined surviving records, prior investigations, witness testimony, and historical analysis to determine whether any viable criminal prosecution remained possible. The review did not revisit rumor. It evaluated documented sequence. The Department of Justice confirmed what earlier state findings had already articulated with caution. The attack on Greenwood was racially motivated, organized in character, and facilitated by failures of protection. The language was explicit. The violence was not described as mutual unrest. It was defined as targeted destruction against a black community. That confirmation carried federal weight. It entered the national record under the authority of the Department of Justice. The federal government exercised power by formally recognizing the massacre as a racially driven assault compounded by institutional failure. It did not seal that recognition in abstraction. It articulated it in written analysis. Yet within the same review, a second conclusion appeared. No living perpetrators remained subject to criminal prosecution. Statutes of limitation had expired for potential federal charges that might have applied. The passage of time, combined with the deaths of those directly involved, rendered criminal proceedings legally impossible. The department did not decline prosecution on evidentiary grounds alone. It declared prosecution unavailable. The consequence was definitive. The highest federal law enforcement authority in the United States acknowledged the massacre's organized and racial character while simultaneously closing the door on penal action. The injustice was named. It was not adjudicated. This moment in 2024 introduced a structural tension. Federal recognition validated the findings of the 2001 Oklahoma Commission and amplified them beyond state boundaries. It also cemented the boundary of accountability. No indictments were issued, no federal grand jury convened, no court examined the conduct of named officials under oath in a criminal trial. For survivors' descendants, the DOJ review functioned as both vindication and limitation. The review did not alter insurance denials from 1921. It did not mandate compensation. It did not reopen civil suits dismissed on procedural grounds. It recorded truth within the confines of legal expiration. The department's analysis acknowledged that law enforcement actions in 1921 included detention of black residents and failure to protect Greenwood. That acknowledgement stands in continuity with prior findings. The federal government did not remove those conclusions from public record. It preserved them. The injustice identified in the opening of this investigation, protection withheld while destruction advanced, remained intact in the 2024 review. What shifted was the scale of acknowledgement. The Federal Archive now carries that recognition alongside the State Archive. The legal consequence of the DOJ's determination is closure. Without punishment. Closure here does not imply resolution. It indicates the exhaustion of prosecutorial avenue. The department did not dispute the scale of harm. It did not revise casualty estimates downward to minimize impact. It did not frame the event as spontaneous riot. It confirmed its organized and racial nature, but confirmation did not trigger sanction. In practical terms, this means that the chain of authority that existed on May 31st and June 1st, 1921, including the role of police chief John A. Gustafson and municipal officials, will never be tested in criminal court. The names remain in historical record, not in indictment. The 2024 review represents the federal government exercising its power to declare a historical judgment. It also represents its inability to translate that judgment into legal consequence. Time operated as shield. The passage of 103 years transformed criminal liability into historical narrative. That transformation does not diminish the event. It alters the available remedy. The victims of Greenwood were detained under martial law in 1921. Their property was destroyed. Their insurance claims were denied. In 2024, their loss was acknowledged at the federal level. It was not redressed through criminal penalty. The Department of Justice's statement closes a prosecutorial chapter that never opened. It confirms that the massacre occurred within a racialized framework and that institutional failures contributed to its scale. It simultaneously confirms that no courtroom will host cross-examination of those decisions. In Washington, the report exists as an official document. In Tulsa, Greenwood Avenue remains rebuilt in fragments, marked by memorials and redevelopment. The law has spoken in recognition. It has remained silent in punishment, and the space between those two outcomes remains part of the record. In the official summaries written decades later, the events of May 31st and June 1st, 1921, are often framed as collapse, order failed, control dissolved, violence overwhelmed capacity, but collapse implies absence. The record from Tulsa suggests something different. Authority remained intact. The administration did not disappear. It chose its priorities. On the night of May 31st, 1921, the Tulsa municipal structure was operational. Police Chief John A. Gustafson retained command authority. The mayor's office functioned. The courthouse was staffed. The Oklahoma National Guard was reachable. The tools of containment, curfew declaration, street restriction, preemptive dispersal, arrest of armed agitators, were available under existing law. They were not deployed at the scale required before escalation crossed into Greenwood. This is where omission shifts from accident to administrative act. To omit in governance is not to do nothing. It is to decide what will not be done. On May 31st, no early citywide curfew was declared before armed civilians gathered in numbers outside the Tulsa County Courthouse. No immediate sealing of access routes toward Greenwood was executed when gunfire first erupted. No rapid redeployment of police units to establish a defensive perimeter at the Frisco railroad tracks was enforced before armed groups crossed into the district. The administration did not lack authority. It declined to apply it decisively at the moment it could still limit geographic expansion. When martial law was declared on June 1st, 1921, it demonstrated that emergency power existed and could be invoked. That declaration proves capacity. It also clarifies timing. The power to impose restriction was not unavailable. It was delayed. The consequence of that delay was structural and permanent. Greenwood's economic core was not merely damaged. It was dismantled. More than 1,200 homes were destroyed. Commercial properties along Greenwood Avenue were reduced to foundations. Insurance claims were later denied under riot exclusions. Land values stagnated for decades. The interruption of compounding capital, documented in the 1920 census and property records, reorganized Tulsa's economic geography. After the fires, proposals emerged within city leadership suggesting new building codes and zoning restrictions that would have made rapid reconstruction in Greenwood more difficult. Although some of those measures were ultimately challenged and adjusted, their initial drafting reveals orientation. The district was treated as a planning problem rather than a protected constituency. In effect, omission during violence was followed by regulation during recovery. The indirect benefit of Greenwood's destruction was measurable. The elimination of a concentrated black commercial district removed a competitive center of independent economic activity. Adjacent white-owned businesses faced less competition. Land redevelopment opportunities expanded. Insurance payouts were minimized. No municipal bankruptcy followed the event. Tulsa's broader oil economy continued its growth trajectory. No city-wide tax surcharge was imposed to compensate Greenwood property owners. No emergency reconstruction fund was established at equivalent scale to the loss. The burden of recovery fell on those who had been displaced and detained. The silence of decisive intervention functioned as action. It permitted a rebalancing of space and capital without formal legislative vote. The reorganization was accomplished through fire and administrative inaction. When authority withholds protection from a specific district while retaining capacity elsewhere, the omission acquires direction. It is not neutral. It reshapes outcomes. The names of those who held power on May 31st and June 1st, 1921, including Police Chief John A. Gustafson and municipal officials, remain in archival record. Their decisions are not preserved in dramatic declarations. They are preserved in absence. No early curfew order issued, no aggressive dispersal documented, no coordinated defensive perimeter enforced before. The district ignited. The destruction of Greenwood did not create a vacuum in Tulsa. It created opportunity. Property changed hands in subsequent years. Development patterns shifted. The economic centrality of Black Wall Street was not restored to pre-1921 levels. This is the enduring consequence of omission treated as non-event. No formal ordinance ordered Greenwood's elimination. No signed directive commanded its dismantling. Yet the failure to intervene when intervention was possible produced an outcome equivalent to deliberate displacement. The city moved forward. The district did not. On May 31st and June 1st, 1921, the administration of Tulsa did not collapse. It functioned within chosen limits. Those limits defined who would be protected and who would not. Omission, in this context, was not silence. It was governance. And governance leaves traces, even when it leaves no order signed. The courthouse remains standing. Greenwood's original footprint does not. In the weeks immediately following June 1st, 1921, the administrative posture of Tulsa did not pivot toward prosecution. It pivoted toward stabilization of reputation. Public statements emphasized restoration, rebuilding, and civic resilience. The municipal frame shifted quickly from emergency to recovery. That transition itself constituted a decision. The language of outrage did not dominate official correspondence. The language of management did. By mid-June 1921, insurance adjusters had already begun processing claims. From Greenwood property owners, many policies were marked under riot exclusion clauses. The classification of the event as a riot rather than targeted arson became materially significant. That classification was not invented by insurers alone. It echoed municipal description. When city authorities did not formally challenge that categorization, they effectively allowed private financial institutions to treat the destruction as non-compensable civil disorder. The consequence was economic. Compression concentrated in one district. No municipal fund was declared on June 2, 1921, to bridge that loss. No citywide bond issue was immediately proposed to reconstruct Greenwood at scale. Instead, property owners were directed into standard claims channels that were structurally stacked against them. In effect, the administrative system processed Greenwood's destruction as a private loss rather than a public failure. At the same time, police records from early June indicate that Black residents were required to carry identification cards to move freely after release from detention. Movement was restricted under martial law. This restriction did not apply equally across the city. The asymmetry persisted beyond the fires. Authority continued to regulate those who had been harmed rather than those who had inflicted harm. The omission of prosecution was not accidental drift. Grand jury proceedings were convened later in 1921. Indictments for incitement and weapons violations were limited and did not target the broader pattern of organized violence against Greenwood. No sweeping conspiracy charge was pursued against municipal actors. The scale of destruction did not produce scale of indictment. Administrative omission also manifested in urban planning debates. Within days of the massacre, city officials discussed potential zoning changes that would have required fireproof construction standards in Greenwood. Such standards, if strictly enforced without subsidy, would have priced many displaced residents out of rebuilding on their own land. Although legal resistance from black attorneys and community leaders prevented permanent displacement through ordinance, the proposal itself revealed orientation. Reconstruction was framed as conditional. The benefit of that orientation did not accrue to Greenwood families. It accrued to stability of municipal liability. By avoiding formal admission of actionable negligence in 1921, the city insulated itself from immediate civil exposure. The absence of official acknowledgement protected municipal coffers. In practical terms, this meant that the economic architecture of Greenwood was forced to restart under diminished capital. Rebuilding occurred, but it was slower, underfunded, and vulnerable to future policy shifts. The compounding growth trajectory visible in 1920 was permanently interrupted. The silence of decisive intervention during violence was followed by the silence of institutional self-protection after it. Neither silence required explicit proclamation. Both required choice. The city's oil-driven expansion continued throughout the 1920s. Downtown Tulsa modernized. Investment flowed into new projects. Greenwood rebuilt portions of its commercial corridor, but it did so without the cushion of restitution. The imbalance widened gradually rather than dramatically. That gradual widening made it less visible as policy and more visible as outcome. In administrative archives, memoranda from June 1921 focus on order restored and normal commerce resumed. The documents do not center the question of why protection failed at scale. The failure is not denied, it is absorbed. This is the structural dimension of omission. It converts a moment of unprotected vulnerability into a long-term reconfiguration of opportunity. No ordinance ordered Greenwood's decline. The absence of decisive intervention and the absence of aggressive post-event accountability accomplished similar effect. By the time federal recognition arrived in 2024, the spatial and financial reorganization of Tulsa had long been normalized. What had once been an autonomous black commercial hub became a historic district marked by memory rather than dominance. The silence of May 31st and June 1st did not echo loudly. It settled into procedure, and procedure, once set, rarely announces itself again. By the early 1930s, Greenwood had rebuilt portions of itself, but the rebuilt district was not the district that had existed on May 30th. 1921, brick storefronts reappeared along Greenwood Avenue. Churches reopened, small businesses resumed operation. On paper, reconstruction had occurred. In financial reality, compounding had been broken. The 1930 U.S. Census reflects that black residents remained concentrated in the Greenwood area. Population continuity did not equal capital continuity. The accumulated equity of 1920 had been incinerated in 1921. Insurance payouts had been widely denied. Deeds and records had been destroyed. Rebuilding depended on limited personal savings, informal credit networks, and community pooling rather than formal banking support at scale. This partial reconstruction was an act of resistance. It was not restoration. The structural loss is measurable. Businesses that had once operated with established clientele and supply chains restarted under debt. Properties rebuilt in the late 1920s carried mortgages without the buffer of prior capital reserves. The economic baseline shifted downward. Ague, district that had once functioned as a consolidated commercial center, operated thereafter in a more fragile state. Municipal policy did not inject capital equivalent to what had been lost. No citywide bond in the 1930s specifically compensated Greenwood property owners for 1921 destruction. No federal recovery program during the New Deal era was tailored to restore pre-massacre wealth levels in that district. Aid, where it came, was general rather than corrective. The consequence was structural. Disparity. Greenwood could exist again as a neighborhood. It could not resume its trajectory as a dominant black commercial hub with uninterrupted growth. This disparity widened further during mid-20th century urban planning decisions. In the 1960s, construction of Interstate 244 physically cut through the northern portion of the Greenwood District. Highway routing was not random. Federal and local authorities selected paths that required land acquisition and demolition in predominantly black neighborhoods across multiple American cities. In Tulsa, that decision removed additional residential and commercial properties from an area still recovering from 1921. The highway did not ignite fire. It removed blocks. Land once consolidated for community use was reassigned under eminent domain. Compensation reflected assessed values that did not account for lost historical capital. Physical continuity fractured, economic density thinned. By the 1970s, urban renewal initiatives further altered Greenwood's footprint. Redevelopment projects prioritized convention facilities and downtown expansion. The district's historical identity was preserved in fragments, not in dominance. Greenwood's memory was formalized through plaques and museums, even as its economic leverage remained constrained. The disappearance here is not of people, but of scale. The Greenwood that had rivaled white commercial corridors in 1920 did not re-emerge in equivalent form. The structural consequence of the 1921 omission compounded across decades. In 1930, black-owned businesses operated again along Greenwood Avenue. In 1950, they persisted. By 1970, the district had been segmented by infrastructure decisions that reduced cohesion. None of these later actions cited the massacre as justification. None were labeled corrective to earlier omission, yet each interacted with a district already weakened by unrepaired loss. The material legacy of omission is visible in capital flow. Wealth interrupted does not simply pause, it diminishes relative to uninterrupted growth elsewhere. The absence of restitution in 1921 translated into limited collateral in 1931, constrained borrowing in 1941, and reduced leverage in 1951. Compounding operates in both directions. Greenwood's resilience is documented, so is its reduced capacity. The injustice presented at the beginning of this investigation, the withholding of decisive protection, did not end when the flames subsided. It extended into the mathematics of opportunity. A district deprived of defense was also deprived of uninterrupted accumulation. Today, portions of Greenwood contain memorial sites, cultural institutions, and small enterprises. They exist within a city that continued to expand around them. The economic ratio between Greenwood and downtown Tulsa never returned to its 1920 proportion. In the 1930s, rebuilding required resolve. It did not restore the original ledger. The foundations poured after the fire stood on land that once held greater value. The names changed, the scale changed, the gap remained, and that gap is the material footprint of omission. The erosion of Greenwood's economic scale did not announce itself in a single ordinance. It appeared in valuation tables, lending patterns, and municipal maps. By the late 1930s, federal housing assessments influenced by homeowners' loan corporation surveys classified many black neighborhoods across the United States as higher risk. While Greenwood had already endured catastrophic loss in 1921, subsequent lending frameworks did not compensate for that vulnerability. They institutionalized it. Credit access shapes reconstruction quality. When districts are assessed as unstable or risky, capital arrives with stricter terms or not at all. Greenwood businesses that reopened after 1931 often relied on informal networks rather than conventional bank financing. The absence of large-scale credit meant incremental rebuilding rather than transformative redevelopment. The city of Tulsa did not declare a targeted municipal investment program in the 1940s designed to offset the compounding disadvantage created by the massacre. Public infrastructure improvements flowed broadly across the expanding metropolitan area. Greenwood received services as part of the city grid, but it did not receive a corrective infusion tied to documented historical loss. This distinction matters because structural inequality often manifests through neutral policy applied to unequal starting points. By treating Greenwood as simply another district in the 1930s and 1940s, rather than as a district whose capital had been erased by violence under municipal oversight, the city allowed disparity to widen through ordinary governance. Property ownership patterns shifted gradually. Some parcels were sold under financial pressure, others were consolidated into fewer hands. The density of independent black-owned institutions that characterized Greenwood in 1920 did not return to prior levels. The transformation was not explosive, it was incremental. The legacy of omission is visible in what was not restored. Banking headquarters, large-scale insurance offices, multi-story commercial complexes comparable to the original Stratford Hotel. These institutions require substantial capital reserves and confidence in long-term stability. Both had been compromised. By mid-century, Greenwood existed as a historically significant but economically constrained district. Memory and enterprise coexisted. The latter operated under narrower margins. When Interstate 244 was constructed in the late 1960s, federal and local authorities exercised eminent domain. Properties were acquired and demolished for right-of-way. Compensation reflected contemporary valuations, not historical interruption. The highway physically divided the neighborhood, altering pedestrian flow and commercial continuity. The decision did not reference 1921. It did not need to. The prior weakening of the district made it less politically resistant to infrastructural incursion. The long-term consequence was spatial fragmentation. A district that had once functioned as a cohesive economic ecosystem became segmented by concrete and traffic corridors. Cultural institutions preserved narrative. Economic dominance did not return. In the decades that followed, efforts to commemorate the massacre increased. Memorials were built, educational programming expanded, recognition of the event's severity became more public. Yet commemoration operates in a different register than capital restoration. The absence that defines Greenwood's post-1930 trajectory is not the absence of people or pride. It is the absence of uninterrupted compounding opportunity. That absence traces back to the failure of decisive protection on May 31st and June 1st, 1921. When authority omits intervention at a critical moment, the resulting damage does not confine itself to a single day. It shapes tax bases, property, appraisals, generational wealth transfers, and political leverage for decades. Greenwood rebuilt in defiance of erasure. It did not regain its pre-massacre structural position within Tulsa's economic hierarchy. The ledger that began in 1920 with growth and confidence was interrupted in 1921. It resumed under constraint in 1931. It narrowed further in 1961. By the time federal acknowledgement arrived in 2024, the material distance between what had been and what remained was embedded in the city's architecture. The district stands today as both testament and evidence. Brick storefronts rise again. Cultural centers welcome visitors. Streets carry the name Greenwood. What they do not carry is the uninterrupted economic momentum that once made the area known as Black Wall Street. The silence of intervention in 1921 did not fade. It compounded, and that compounding is still measurable in the map. On June 1st, 2021, 100 years after the fires, the city of Tulsa held its centennial ceremonies. Public officials stood before microphones. Names were spoken aloud. Memorials were unveiled. The language was careful, measured, solemn. Recognition, at last, had entered the civic calendar. Yet ceremonies do not retry cases. The skyline that now frames Greenwood contains glass and steel where brick once stood. The highway still divides what had once been continuous. Visitors walk through curated exhibitions detailing what occurred between May 31st and June 1st, 1921. Archival. Photographs are displayed under controlled light. Official statements acknowledge failure. The record is no longer denied. But no commander was ever prosecuted. No courtroom cross-examined the decisions that shaped those hours. The chain of authority that remained intact on the night of May 31st dissolved only into time, not into verdict. The name of Police Chief John A. Gustafson persists in historical documents. It appears in reports, in footnotes, in reconstructed timelines. It does not appear in sentencing records. The omission remains part of the archive, not part of a judgment. Greenwood did not fall solely to armed civilians. It fell because protection was withheld when it was still possible, because authority, present and operational, did not move with the force required to prevent irreversible loss. The silence preceded the smoke. The delay preceded the destruction. The consequences outlived both. And so, the centennial did what institutions often do after a century. It illuminated what could no longer be denied, while leaving intact what could no longer be prosecuted. In the quiet hours after the commemorations ended, the memorial grounds grew still again. The plaques remained, the speeches faded, the names stayed engraved in metal and stone. History once sealed now sits open, but not fully answered. Beyond the Golden Halls was never about spectacle. It is about the spaces where decisions were made, the corridors where orders were withheld, the documents that survived in drawers while others vanished in flame. If you remain with us, you remain where records breathe and sealed doors eventually open, so that you're here when the next sealed door finally opens. Leave your thoughts below. Every perspective helps illuminate what history tried to bury. If this story resonated with you, let us know. It tells the algorithm these forgotten halls are worth exploring again. And if you're willing to step deeper into the shadows, the next chamber awaits. Because Greenwood's story does not end in 1921. It lingers in planning offices, in court dismissals, in the language of recognition without restitution. It lingers in maps that no longer match the ledger books of 1920. The hall is quiet now. The documents are returned to their folders. The lights dim. Footsteps recede down a marble corridor that once echoed with decisions never formally recorded. Some secrets survive only because those who feared them left no one to tell the truth. And sometimes, the silence is the final witness.